Another question? But just real quick, you may have answered it, but what is the biggest surprise reaction you had? Was it that the women were having a polarized feeling and the men were weeping? Or what's the biggest surprise you've had reaction to your book? Good or bad, or like that? So.
Well, one thing that's really interesting to me, which is, when I was over in England and they were like, well, it's an election year. What are people saying about the book? And I was like, no one is talking about it. I mean, that's kind of the most interesting thing about it, is that it's a book about a guy who shoots a presidential candidate in an election year, and no one addresses that or talks about it as a subject, which I think, I find interesting. I think there's a sort of like, be careful what you say out loud quality to it. One of the interesting things that sort of conclusions that I draw in after writing this book is, you look at these lone gunmen and these guys who shot, presidents and congresswomen, and it's amazing to me how unpolitical these acts seem. I mean, I think at a certain point in history it was a political statement and you shoot the candidate for what they believe or what they're advocating. I mean, Sirhan was kind of the last one who said, Robert Kennedy supports Israel and he said these things and I have to kill him. But, you get to John Hinckley, who, he was following Jimmy Carter around. And there's footage of him standing 20 feet away from Jimmy Carter, and then a couple months later he shoots Reagan. I mean, you can't say it's political when either candidate will do. I mean, we have these celebrity-in-chiefs, I think, this kind of polarized, electoral process where people use, there's such violence in the language about how these candidates talk about each other and these parties talk about each other. And if you're the right kind of person and you're susceptible and you're kind of lost, and they seem to make a good target. So that's been interesting to me, is that it's, I think it's easier here to talk about it like a thriller, like a Hollywood thing, like, oh, he shoots a presidential candidate in the abstract. So that's been surprising to me. So yeah.
Did you have to do a lot of research on guns and gun culture?
I did some.
Kind of technical stuff in there. And what was that like?
Well, I did some. I mean, I've only shot guns a couple of times. I went with a Canadian screenwriter friend of mine to a gun range in LA, and they basically, they hand you a gun and they handed us like a 9mm, and she said, well, I need you to show me that you can disarm the gun, pop the clip, and empty the chamber. And I muddled my way through it, and she said, I would let you get away with that, except you pointed it at your friend the whole time. I did some research. I mean, it's so easy as a writer now to use the internet. We have a library in Austin called the Harry Ransom Center that collects the archives of writers, and they have Don DeLillo's archive, who wrote Libra, which was his book about the Kennedy assassination, and there's literally hundreds of boxes of material that he compiled, and he would go to he'd go to people's garages in Dallas, conspiracy nuts and whatever, and I just have to go to their websites. So it's a lot easier for me. So, but I live most of the time in Texas now, and it's not a rabid gun culture. I mean, certainly Austin is not. Like, don't mess with Texas, but I think there are large parts of the country where owning a gun is like owning a shovel. It's just part of the heritage. It's a tool, and people don't politicize it.
But it also seems to figure pretty significantly in the mind of the...
Yeah. Well, I think, guns are they take on such a elevated status.
I'm good. How are you? I want a coffee.
Because they're so taboo, to like a East Coast liberal kid. The idea that you could just walk into a store and buy a gun, it has this taboo kind of magic to it, I think that can be the danger of making anything a taboo, drugs or alcohol or guns, is that there's a sexiness to them, you know, where it is just a tool. You know, I wanted to. I mean, the gun didn't make him do it, but certainly if he didn't have the gun. You know, I was in England and they like to talk about guns a lot, and I said, at a certain point I was like, well, so what, you guys just have a lot of stabbings over here? I mean, it's not like without guns there's no violence, but you know, at the same time, you know, the gun can raise the violence to just an obscene level, so, yeah. Did that get me in trouble while I'm in San Francisco? So.